Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk. I'm Shekhar Gupta, and let me tell you one thing. I've been a journalist for 30 years. And what do I do when I have a grave doubt in a professional situation? And what do you do? Possibly some of you, many of you refer to a great scripture, the Gita, the Bible, the Quran. I remember some passage from the autobiography of the man who's my guest today. Benjamin Bradlee, the iconic editor of the Washington Post, arguably the greatest editor of our times, or of all times. Ben Bradlee, what a privilege to have you on Walk the Talk and in New Delhi.
Nice to be here. Wonderful to be here. That's an awfully good introduction. You could do that again.
You should be used to it, but I want to say something else to you. It's one of those moments when I love my job, because if I wasn't a journalist, I won't be walking and chatting with Benjamin Bradlee.
Let's see at the end of the conversation whether you're still pleased.
Well, everything you did as an editor is something that journalists around the world fantasize about, including the fact that you lasted 24 years in the job.
Yes, I lasted a long time. Well, I had a wonderful owner, you know that. People ask me, what is the secret to being a great journalist? And I tell them that it is having a great owner of the newspaper and someone who spends a lot of time choosing you. But once they choose you, they leave you pretty much alone. Right. And I didn't realize how important that was, but I had it. Catherine Graham was a wonderful person.
And she stayed the course with you through Pentagon Papers, Watergate.
Oh, yes, yes. And she was so personally involved. I mean, she came down to the newsroom maybe 3-4 times a day. Never left the office at the end of the day without either calling or coming down to the newsroom and, what's in tomorrow's paper. She was so excited and so interested.
But you never saw her walk in or out on cold feet?
No. And also she never told me what to do.
Right.
She said, what are you going to do?
Right.
Wow, that's a wonderful owner. If I owned a newspaper, I don't think I'd let you run it for me. I would, I'd like to, if I owned it, I think I'd like to run it.
In fact, that's the interesting part. Most editors, when they write their autobiographies, sometimes, more often than not, they vent their spleen with the owner. Your autobiography is so friendly to the publisher, and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, we had,
as well.
We were writing books at the same time.
Right.
She was writing her own.
Right.
And I was writing mine. And so we would check in, how's the book coming, she would say to me, and I would ask her the same question. And then I said, you're the big cheese around here. You go first. You publish your book at the first. And she said, no, I wouldn't do that. So I said, I went first. I published it first. I've forgotten when even a part of the year.
But frankly, both these books should be standard text in every journalism school. Because I'm fortunate because I started as a reporter 1 year after Watergate.
You did? And it was that vivid in your mind? I find that...
Absolutely, and that was a time when there was no TV, very little state-owned TV here,
yeah,
and no internet. But it was in the papers, and I think the Woodstein School sent a lot of talented people into J schools, isn't it?
Oh, it did. There's no question. It attracted, and strangely, one of the things in America that it attracted women journalists.
I see.
There hadn't been a great many women journalists. And then they made that movie with Redford and all those people. And that attracted more.
And they thought reporters looked like that.
Yeah.
So when did you first realize you were onto something really big? We all know it started as a burglary.
Yeah, I know. I wish I could tell you that I knew early. I thought, look, once we traced the money in the pocket of the burglars to a man who had given that money to the committee to re-elect the President of the United States, we said, oh my God, it's in the White House. This comes from the Republicans. And then once, it was the money, that first time we got the money.
And tell me, Mr. Bradlee, what was the most difficult moment in that phase? A big ethical or editorial dilemma?
I don't know that. Let me tell you the day that you didn't have a story, that was the day that killed you because you thought the story was going to die.
Right.
But we held their noses underwater. I mean, we made them.
And the threats and the fears.
Not many of the threats. A couple of times, members of the cabinet would say, "Do you guys know what you're doing?" And they'd say, "You better be right, because if you're wrong." Well, if we were wrong, we would have had to resign, and we would be out of the business.
Right.
It's quite serious.
Right.
Yeah.
But they were threats held out at some point.
I mean, I don't remember receiving a threat from anyone in the
Right.
White House. I remember,
Threatening language.
yeah, I remember him. There were two members of the Nixon cabinet. One was Kissinger,
Right.
who said,
Who's been a guest on Walk the Talk, incidentally.
"Oh, he has."
His
Well-
view of India has changed now completely.
Yeah. Well, he said he didn't know anything about this,
Right.
and because it had nothing to do with foreign affairs. But he said, you better be right about this. and there was a man called Peterson who now works for, he's an investment man, and he was saying, "I can't believe what you're writing." He says, "I don't see any sign of that in the White House."
But did you ever have any doubts that maybe we were being sold a lemon, maybe the story wasn't as good? Did you go to bed someday thinking or hoping, God, we are right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I go to bed every night. For all my career, I go to bed saying, "I hope we're right." But there was a point, I don't know exactly when it was. 400 stories. That's a lot of stories. Once we found the money in the White House, and then you had the legislature, you had the court inquiry, then you had the legislative inquiry. We knew we didn't close the circle.
Right.
Until just a month before. We were just beginning to go good.
And then you had to handle that, a little ethical setback.
Oh.
The Pulitzer that went wrong.
A little one, a monster.
Monster.
But,
What happened? Just tell us.
Well, this is the Janet Cook story.
Janet Cook story.
Janet Cook was a young female reporter who was, she wrote very well, she was very pretty, dressed well, and she got this wonderful story about how a young 11-year-old child, I think it was, had been turned on to drugs by her mother and the mother's boyfriend. And we plastered it all over page one, and we had a particularly poignant illustration. And I could see it in my mind's eye now. Not a photo, but an illustration. And it turned out to be a lie. Every word of it was a lie. So that there was no such person. And when we finally, we won the Pulitzer Prize for the story. And so that was almost a year later. And then people, there was one person told me that, maybe the story was wrong. And we said, if it is wrong, it's a disaster. You know the business. If you can't print lies.
Right.
And the only way out was to lead the charge, to prove it was wrong, and to tell the public that it was wrong. And there has never been any information about that story that we didn't print.
That you didn't concede.
Right away. And we printed, we did a huge investigative reporting job on it.
To quote the line made famous by an iconic Indian corporation today, which sets the standards for corporate governance. When in doubt, disclose.
Oh, when in doubt, disclose, and yes, and lead the pack.
And
Don't have somebody else disclose about you.
Right. Mr. Bradlee, our business has been changing. In America, for example, there is all this debate about newspapers losing circulation.
Yeah.
In India, they aren't. In fact, they are growing very robustly.
Good.
which is a good thing. I was reading your long interview with Jim Lehrer, where you were asked the same question.
Yeah.
And you were asked, what can newspapers do to prevent this from happening? And you said, you used one word, good stories.
Well, good stories and the truth, and true stories. Tell the truth, and a newspaper has to entertain, has to instruct, has to be useful to the public, really useful. But and if it is, and if the stories are good, if the stories keep coming, you know, that's what's so tough as an editor. You could sit down at, say, 8 o'clock at night and look at the first edition and say, by God, that's pretty good. But you better hurry and have something good coming up, because there are 5 more editions the next day.
So what do you see changing with journalism now in the US, because that's where you are?
Well,
in so many ways, media around the world takes the view from America.
here's the problem, that it isn't so much television is a competing source. I mean, when I was growing up, I learned how to read on newspapers. That was my text to learn as an 8-year-old,
Right.
7-year-old. Now, you can't do that. But readers, it begins with the newspapers. If there were no newspapers, the first people to suffer would be the television stations.
How do you say so?
Well, where do they get their ideas for stories? They get their ideas from the papers, and it's amazing. You can see them. I discovered this on 24-hour radio news. We have 2 of those stations in Washington. I drive into work, and you could almost hear the newspaper at the broadcast house go over like this. And then he wouldn't read exactly his story, but he'd tell a story that was in front of him on the paper. And then when he was through that, you could almost hear him turn the page. And if you robbed him of the paper, the radio station would shut up. There would be nothing.
But this question comes up very often in media discussions now, and people say that blogging is the way, citizen journalists, you can do your own news.
Yeah.
And I, being old-fashioned, try to argue that citizens, you can't have citizen doctors and citizen lawyers, how can you have citizen journalists? And people say, no, but you guys rely too much on the anonymous source. And I always try to say, but Deep Throat was an anonymous source.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in our business that you can't always identify the source.
Right.
One little trick is that newspapermen don't like to not identify. So maybe 5 times out of 10, at the end of the story, they will have mentioned the name of the person who they were quoting anonymously in a
So people
different
can
context.
put 2 and 2 together.
Well, you can deduce it, yeah.